Regulations are actually good for business. Like not violating human rights is good for business. This is somebody who has a history of talking about democracy in a performative way with no stakes whatsoever. We're not on Mars. And yet, when confronted with actual collective power, sees it as a threat. How are the ways that they're governed and the choices that they make going to guide participation? The truths that it purports to hold can only be partial truths.
Hello, welcome to Web3 Revolution. This is a series of episodes exploring the next generation internet. We'll bring builders, doers, and active participants of this exciting revolution to our show to have conversations with us. This podcast is for education and information purposes. We'll provide accurate information to the best of our knowledge, but the podcast content should not be taken as investment advice. I'm your host, Hana. Today, my co-host, Hehe, is with me here. Hehe, do you want to say hi to everyone?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hehe. I'm super excited to be here.
Today, I'm really excited to welcome our guest, Nathan Schneider, to be our conversation. He's a journalist and author who covers social movement in the United States. Since 2015, he's been a professor of media studies in the University of Colorado, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab. He's the author of Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy. And Nathan is one of the earliest advocates for democratizing the ownership of Twitter. And he's editing Vitalik's upcoming new book, Proof of Stake, The Making of Ethereum and the Philosophy of Blockchain, which will come out this year in September. Nathan, if you want to say hi to everyone who is listening.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Nathan, you've been recording all kinds of social movements since Occupy Wall Street. And as a journalist, you first started using it heavily during the Arab Spring in 2011. And Twitter actually enabled you to follow events on the ground in real time and connects you with, activists directly. Just drawing from my personal experience, Twitter to me, as someone who was raised and born in China, and to many people who, like me, like Chinese netizens, means the realm beyond political control. So, if you're a cool kid, you will probably, download VPN for Instagram or Facebook. And if you're a woke kid, you'll probably download VPN for information out there on Twitter. In 2009, when I first learned how to use VPN to jump across a great firewall, Twitter would actually be my first destination or the only destination because it's full of uncensored political information that you would never see on Weibo or WeChat. It literally means freedom, civic space, or nest of political dissents for me. And before entering Web3, my following list on Twitter were actually only human rights activists, journalists, and feminists. So can you tell me what Twitter means to you throughout these years, and why do you think people are so attached to Twitter?
Well, especially at that moment of the 2011 uprisings, it was a time where this social movement was kind of spreading across borders and going from Tunisia to Egypt to across the Middle East to Europe, then to the United States and many other places. It, had manifestations in China and Hong Kong and Taiwan later on as well. It seemed like this was a conveyance, it was a tool, a medium that was enabling this global public sphere to spread and had become this kind of vital utility for reasons that you described, and for so many more. And that the accountability and the structure of this utility matters so much. And yet that moment, when I wrote an article first in 2016 calling for Twitter to be user owned, it was a time when Twitter was potentially up for sale. Another time, because it never really made sense in a lot of respects as like a big tech company. It made money, but not a whole lot. And it just had this kind of special role in the public discourse, not necessarily as a super business of the Facebook and Google sort. It just seemed like a mismatch that this thing that was serving this global public sphere was actually, in real legal fact, a commodity to be bought and sold. That's a result of the particular kinds of business models, financing structures, legal regimes that Twitter grew up in. It's a result of its origins. It always just seemed like a deep problem. Why is it that such an important utility is just actually a public corporation in the United States? Why can't we translate some of that kind of global connectedness that the platform actually enables into the structure of the company itself. I look to examples like the Green Bay Packers, a football team here in the US that's owned by the community of Green Bay. But at the same time, I think there's an opportunity to do something very new here. And here I think is where something like Web3 might come in, to recognize that these are global utilities that we need to start learning how to own and govern in a global context in order to deepen our connectedness against this push toward the kind of splinter net, this separation of various national internets that we increasingly see.
Yeah, Hehe and I actually had some conversation about how social network as utility. Maybe Hehe, you can follow up with your question.
Absolutely. I love what Nathan you just said about Twitter being like a public utility or the idea of a public corporation, even though it's currently still like a private company. So what do you think are the characteristics for this type of public utilities and corporations? And what would be your ideal vision for it in terms of governance and economics moving forward?
Well, to me, the goal is not to say I have the perfect vision for how it should be structured. The hope has always been, let's have a conversation about what we actually want for this. When we did a shareholder proposal in 2017 to the company, we didn't say, you have to adopt this particular structure. We said, invest some resources in exploring what user ownership might look like. So our goal there is really to spur a conversation. So we compared it, for instance, to the Green Bay Packers, which is owned by individual fans, as are many, for instance, European football teams, or the Associated Press, which is owned by different media companies that use it. There are all kinds of different ways you can do shared ownership. To me, it's a design space. It's a space for creativity and an opportunity for exploration. We have some analogs in the past, like the ones I've mentioned. When we talk about public utilities, historically, at least in the United States, the examples that arise are like railroads or power companies. They may be private companies, but they have some responsibilities to the public, special responsibilities, because they have a kind of what's called a natural monopoly, which means that they have kind of special access to a resource that everybody relies on. So they are therefore have special responsibilities. And, clearly large, important social media networks have some of those characteristics. And as a result, we need to think about what these kinds of public utilities look like, not just in a moment where we happen to share a territory with those utilities and we all live in the same country or the same state or whatever it is, but actually in a context where that public utility has a global role.
Just like a follow-up to that, you mentioned in the past, private companies serve as the kind of the intermediate role, like they serve partially to fulfill public goods and provide public utilities. Do you think this is something that's more of a transitional phase?
Well, so in the years since that campaign in 2017, I've been working with a lot of the same people on this idea of exit to community, which is basically a story about how startups can become community owned. And again, it's a story that doesn't have a particular model or strategy associated with it. It's more a network of companies that are exploring in their own ways. What are our options? What could we do? And this, I think, is a kind of adventure that I hope more and more of us get on together, is how can we figure out ways so that the future is more community owned, more accountable than the past. For Twitter, I think there are good reasons that we end up with Elon Musk apparently buying this company, because we are operating in an economic system here in the United States that is designed to privilege the power of individual large investors and corporate large investors over the power of collectives of people. It's very hard for groups of people to access financing, whereas for Elon Musk, it's quite easy. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it does raise the question, what would it take for us to have a system in which it was actually easier for groups of people to access capital for reasonable things? Maybe we would have fewer places with bad internet connectivity because communities would be able to access financing and get it set up for themselves. All sorts of things that are missing in a system that is driven by investor returns and investor interests that could be possible if we had a framework that was more built around enabling community ownership and community financing. So the vision is really not one particular model. It's how do we enable community ownership at all levels of many different kinds so that when a startup is getting going, when a project is getting going, when a new organization is starting, there's a broad design space of the different ways in which we can be accountable to our stakeholders. And it's up to those founders and to those builders, like, what is the right accountability? What is the accountability we want to work toward? And to make sure that those people who are putting that energy in see a reward for the communities they build. So to me, Twitter is just kind of a particularly acute case of what's really a much broader systemic problem. And in the years since 2017, the exit to community conversation has developed a lot. There are a lot more investors interested in it. There's a lot more founders doing it, companies doing it out in the open, like Open Collective, which is kind of like a Patreon for open source projects, an amazing company that is public about its intention to transition through exit to community. And these kinds of examples show that there's a desire, that there are options out there, there are possibilities, but we're still not at the level where there's a pathway for a company like Twitter. It's kind of trapped. It's kind of locked in to this prison of 20th century corporate law. And we need to find a pathway towards something that, is more appropriate for the kinds of products, the kinds of companies, the kinds of networks we're now building.
Yeah. So it feels like we're sort of at a breaking point where there's the struggle with the old system and then this new desire to have like a newer paradigm, even though like the particular path towards it could be very diverse. It could be up to like the entities themselves to decide whether it's a DAO or a co-op or something else. But there's a diffusion of power from more centralized corporations, like the railroads companies in the 18th century, 20th century, towards a more decentralized power dynamic governed by the community. Is that correct?
Yeah, though I wouldn't say it's a steady kind of progressive line, because, for instance, you mentioned the cooperative tradition. In British corporate law, the cooperative statutes are about as old as the investor ownership statutes. It's a parallel tradition, and it's one that had a significant role in developing the industrialized world. And we have to remember that. For instance, rural electrification in the United States, happened not through a government corporation or simply public ownership, not through investor ownership because investors weren't interested, but through the development of cooperatives. And cooperatives essentially solved the rural electrification problem. In my country, my grandfather grew up on a farm with no electricity until a co-op came. So these are very, very powerful tools, and they have been in the past. We just have to remember how to use them and how to adapt them to this new moment. There is a sense in which we're starting to realize that we've put too much power in the hands of the investor ownership model, and we've forgotten something that we've had all along. We've forgotten this legacy of community ownership. And to the extent that, for instance, the tools around Web3 can enable that recovery, that return, that recognition of community ownership, I think that's very exciting. At the same time, I think there are very clear signals as well that a lot of the tendencies in Web3 are actually just accentuating the power and the logic of investor ownership and investor control, turning things into speculative assets, not public utilities or common goods. So, I think we're at a really important crossroads, and we need to be very wary of the fact that this technology that has the capacity for community ownership, nevertheless, does not guarantee that that is the outcome.
Right. Yeah, technology alone can't save us. I think that's a very well put argument there. I know Hana has more questions about the Twitter acquisition she wants to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Elon Musk definitely surprised everyone last week. And he was actually really, really productive from bringing up the idea of buying Twitter to actually finishing up buying it. I actually want to read one of his tweets after he made the decision and ask if, Nathan, you have any comments on it. So the tweet would be, I also want to make Twitter better than ever by enhancing the product with new features, making the algorithm open source to increase trust, defeating the spam bots, and authenticating all humans. Twitter has tremendous potential. I look forward to working with a company and a community of users to unlock it. It seems like Elon Musk shared a lot of ideas, from you 5 years ago. Like, how would you see this whole thing?
I think it's very worrying. I don't think Twitter has necessarily been on a great path, but I don't think it's been quite as catastrophic as he suggests. It worries me that it feels like a power play. It feels like somebody who happens to be very, very, very wealthy kind of trying to take hold of a prize. And maybe he'll do good things with it, you never know. But there are some real dangers here. One, for example, is that he's kind of put Tesla at risk in the process, right? I think Tesla is a really important company, a really, remarkable achievement of not only him, but other people who've first founded it and who've put so much ingenuity into it. And here in the US in particular, it's really accelerated the electric car market and compelled other companies to step up when they were dragging their feet. And so the fact that he is risking the health of that company is a bit worrying. He's always been one to take risks. So, I give him that credit, but that's one concern. The fact that this acquisition, it's like the cost of so much kind of potential poverty alleviation and, climate activism and policy shifts. The amount of money at play here, it's just a shame that it's being used for, I think a kind of rich person's game. Finally is his track record for democracy. He's claimed that democracy is his interest here. I remember once at South by Southwest, big conference in Austin, he said that on Mars there will be direct democracy, right? People voting on proposals. At the same time, he was really ruthlessly suppressing unionization in Tesla factories. So this is somebody who has a history of talking about democracy in a performative way with no stakes whatsoever. We're not on Mars. And yet, when confronted with actual collective power, sees it as a threat and as a danger. And, I think it's very worrying that what democracy means to somebody with this much power and this much of a history of believing himself right when refusing to listen to anybody else and refusing to see the value of collective power in even his own workplace. So, I don't take anything he says at this point seriously. I just observe the fact that the richest person in the world just bought one of the most important public spaces in the world. And that very fact does not incline me to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And I do want to follow up with his top-down approach and his personality cult. As Elon seems to be an iron grip boss who previously pushed Tesla and SpaceX to achieve so much things tremendously by delivering a lot of features of new things really fast without doing, a lot of checks. What do you think of the management style would work on Twitter? And eventually my imagination would be he's going to be the decision maker. How do you think we can, check balance of making sure, everything is sane?
I can't pretend to predict what he's going to do or what kind of effect it will have on Twitter. Again, I'm perfectly open to the possibility that he will make it the greatest public square the world has ever seen and facilitate a transition to accountable ownership on this marvelous kind of tokenized democracy. He seems to share with Jack Dorsey the vision of some kind of more decentralized version of the company. One thing that happened after our shareholder resolution, they didn't adopt it, of course, but Jack Dorsey did establish this kind of spin-off called Blue Sky, treating Twitter as a decentralized protocol, which is, I think, one really viable path toward a kind of community ownership is say, okay, nobody owns the main thing, but lots of people can own services on it, and people can have that more local accountability to their entry point. One of the things we did too out of that campaign is we created a Mastodon instance, a decentralized federated network that's similar to Twitter. It's called social.coop. So that's what it is. We participate in a much broader network that includes lots of people we dislike, but we get to control our node where we access that network. And it makes for a very nice community. It makes for a very nice kind of social network. Musk might take the company in that kind of direction. And, there are good reasons to think that that's what he might do. That could be very positive, but I really don't know what he's going to bring to this. Again, I tend to keep my eyes less on the personality peculiarities of a given person and more on, what are the structural forces at work that I think explain a lot of what's going on. And he is an aggressive billionaire and someone who has sought to accumulate power in an unprecedented way. Some of the outcomes of that, I think, have been positive and remarkable. I love watching the videos of those SpaceX boosters landing slowly on the landing pad. I could watch those all day. Thank you, Elon Musk. That's a wonderful contribution to the human experience. But still, that doesn't take away from the concerns I think we all have to have about the power accumulation that this man has historically operated through. And so, we just need to be very careful.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just quickly follow up on that, if that's okay. So, like, you just talked about kind of this platform corporatism, and then, like, access to communities. In the past podcast that we've listened to, you've also talked about kind of it's not just enough to focus on this idea, but also like look at like the core business vision, product market fit, and a community of interest. And maybe when you're looking at successful corporatives, there's usually kind of a key entrepreneur or someone that you described as a benevolent dictator. So I'm curious, like, do you think Elon would be that kind of a benevolent dictator in your point of view?
Well, I think the very idea of a benevolent dictator is a crazy one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this outgrowth of, this pattern that I call implicit feudalism. That's part of the logic of online platforms for communities since the oldest BBSs before the internet, the bulletin board services that would run out of somebody's home, where whoever starts the thing has administrative control, which is basically absolute power over the system forever, as long as they want it. It's a convenient approach from a systems design perspective. It's very nice for computers because they don't have to think about politics. But for human systems, it's a very poor way of governing. And most healthy communities that start that way kind of outgrow their benevolent dictator in one way or another. There's just an example, for instance, of the programming language Python had its founder as a benevolent dictator for decades. And then finally he got sick of some argument and stormed off and left. And the community went through this whole process of trying to figure out what to do. And they explored all these different options and ended up with like a totally reasonable, boring elected board structure, which they probably should have had years before. So often, because of the kind of lock-in of power in both kind of technical systems and corporate life, we end up with these so-called benevolent dictators. It's a real failure of imagination. And there's no need to have a dictator, benevolent or not. We know how to do better systems. We know how to build accountability into systems. And even in cases where you have a project where where really hard decisions have to be made and you want to centralize that authority to some degree, at least have a plan for how you're going to exit that. This platform I've been building at my lab here called Community Rules, a tool to help groups figure out their governance structures. In our benevolent dictator template, which we have because a lot of groups have that structure, we have a kind of box for the exit. How do you get out of that benevolent dictator situation? What is the point at which you no longer need that benevolent dictator, right? And too often we don't ask that question, forgetting that people die, forgetting that nobody's run of luck is forever. And every organization needs some transitions and needs some accountability of some sort. That idea that we accept benevolent dictatorship as an acceptable governance strategy, whether of our countries, of our companies, of now public utilities, is to me a really dangerous failure of imagination. And it's one that, honestly, I think we've learned from the online systems that we've been part of. We've all been part of communities where there is no accountability. We're just relying on the admin, the moderator to be nice. So we're practicing it in our daily lives. In that respect, it's not surprising that we would not expect better at the largest scales of our society. So in a kind of paradoxical respect, I think there's a sense in which these big questions about who is governing these large systems actually begins with our daily lives and the daily practice, the daily politics that we do online. This is the topic of my next book and something that I'm really eager to explore more deeply, this relationship between the everyday and the largest scales of political life.
Yeah, well, it's super exciting.
And talking about this political life participation, and I know you often talk about community ownership, let's pounding this concept to this essence. What constitute a community or we? I mean, for myself as someone who's a woman, who's a minority, someone who might in the future endure this perpetual foreignness in the US, how to make this community concept more inclusive? I know you talk about Twitter should serve as a global utility, and But we need to be really honest with ourselves. This podcast is in English, right? This podcast is focusing on this Web3 revolution mostly happening in the US. So how can we make sure that this community includes broadly to more people who should own Twitter?
I think that's a great question. And I use this term community knowing that it is intentionally vague because it does need to mean so many different things in different contexts. For the context of one company, the community might really be the employees. For another, it might be the users. For another, it might be nothing quite so broad, but actually a particular historical community, an ethnic community, a language community, some community constituted by its marginalization. So much of the legacy of the co-op movement here in the US, for instance, has come out of the experience of African Americans who have been shut out of conventional economic systems and used cooperative structures in order to have autonomy and control over their own economies. So it really poses the question to us at every turn, what do we mean by community? And I hope that we don't always treat that question as if the answer is obvious, but to recognize that we need to constitute our communities really, really intentionally. We've been talking about borders and kind of a global question. In the 20th century, the global community was generally understood structurally as relationships among territorial nations. So different territorial nations would come together at the United Nations or at the International Criminal Court or whatever, and they would decide based on what their representatives did. Or, trade deals, for instance. Today, I think there is reason to suspect that people want to constitute community without having to rely on their particular nation states as the primary vehicle of their membership in the global community. People might live in a country that they don't identify with strongly, or that tries to suppress the kind of voice that they want to have. In so many cases, we need to rethink how we draw the lines of global community where we're not so reliant on who our national territorial representatives are, but in which people can be represented, can represent themselves, more directly, more authentically. What does that look like? I want to have that conversation. I think we see glimpses of it in all kinds of online networks where people are able to participate and connect without permission from their particular leaders. It's this conversation that I think we need and that we're so overdue for. We're at a moment of so much retrenchment into the nation state, into ethno-nationalism, into borders. That could be a major turn back toward that idea of territory as our primary identification. I hope that it's actually just kind of, a last gasp, this world in which our politics, our humanity is defined so much by where we happen to live, where we happen to be born.
Right. We're seeing this new formation of cultures, and the idea of sovereignty is I think taking on a new definition and shape as we're seeing more of these digital communities in the past decades forming, and then now with Web3 and cryptocurrency and all that taking into a new level. So definitely.
And we have to really be aware that, the last wave of so-called globalization should give us a lot of pause, right? Because it was a globalization of capital, not a globalization of people, right? It was a globalization that enabled corporations to spread around the world and control the policies of local places, while most people, working people, did not have that kind of mobility generally, and were, essentially trapped as capital flowed. And again, that is a reminder that as we create new global networks, we're at a crossroads. What are we going to allow to flow? What are we designing our networks around? Are we designing them around people and a conception of rights and a conception of the public and the common? Or are we designing them around a conception of private goods, privately controlled, that can flow to the exclusion of the people that these capital flows control? Again, I think there's a lot of ways in which you could imagine Web3 and crypto and all this stuff really just deepening the pattern of the first wave of globalization. Okay, just let the capital flow and let the people stay in their prisons,
Yeah. I certainly feel the way you describe it as a prison. I remember when I was a lot younger, as someone who, browsed online, you were called a netizen, right? And then gradually over the time, you're being reduced to a user, where previously you have to, put in at least a website address to the browser, and now you're just simply being asked to swipe your fingers on the screen and to be fed with, random stuff that algorithm believe you would like. So the author, also a historian, Julian Barnes once wrote, "History is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfection of memory meet the inadequacies of documentation." So like in the long run, you as a professor and a journalist, do you think Twitter will serve as one of the most important archive for human history? And in the long run, what does Twitter mean for humanity?
It's a really interesting question. For instance, here in the US, the Library of Congress has gathered the Twitter archives as part of its archive. I'm kind of terrified of my own Twitter ramblings as being something that would be part of a longstanding record. And I think there's something deceptive about such a massive archive, because too easily, when we see all this data, we neglect to notice what is missing from it. And because there's so much of it, we think we have everything. I mean, I know that, my colleagues who do big data type research, they love Twitter because unlike Facebook and a lot of other platforms, like it's very easy to crawl and run data requests on and do kind of fun statistical work on. The problem is, what are the things that those other networks might be seeing that Twitter just doesn't see because of certain features of it? What biases are built in? And what parts of ourselves are we showing there? I mean, I have a friend who, as we've been friends, became a kind of major social media influencer type, right? This is his life now and his livelihood. And all the time, he's talking about how he feels like he can only be a very specific part of himself on this network. He has a very instrumental presence on it, and there are all kinds of things that he would want to say that he doesn't feel comfortable saying because it could lose him a community. And that's fine. That's a very reasonable choice for him to make. But it does put us in a position, if we're going to be historical, about just being cautious and recognizing that the truths that it purports to hold can only be partial truths. This goes back to that question of ownership and control. Twitter is not, any of these social networks are not objective truth holders. They are shaped by the people who control them. They're shaped by the incentives that control them, right? And those incentives matter so much. They steer us in all sorts of ways toward how we behave on the platform. And if we treat Twitter, for instance, as a historical document, we have to recognize that it is shaped by the business model and by the ownership and by the accountability that the platform has. We have to recognize that that data is biased. It's guided by all the kind of algorithmic forces that have been developed by people trying to figure out how to make this a profitable company, being accountable, whether they're accountable to their early investors or to public stock markets or to Elon Musk. And so if we are to treat this as such a important record of humanity, it's all the more reason to want to have a situation where actually we could say the people who are on it had a say in deciding what those incentives are, what that accountability looked like.
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time discussing Twitter, and I know you are also a really prolific writer and professor. So why don't Hehe ask the following questions about your new upcoming book?
Yeah, I'm really excited to read about this book that you're editing along with Vitalik on the proof of stake and the making of Ethereum, the philosophy of blockchains. So is there anything at this moment you can share with us? Any teasers, and what excites you most about this book?
It's actually a book I've been thinking about for years. As many of us in this kind of scene have been. I've known Vitalik since first interviewed him in 2014. As many of us have experienced, he's a unique voice. I just remember so many times over the years, reading his essays in order to write some academic paper about them, but feeling like, wow, this is really a pleasure. This is fun. He's an unusual writer, and I've really experienced this with editing. He has a very conversational and kind of unorthodox style, but it's part of what I think connects with people. I was really affected when I first read his white paper, in early 2014. And at the same time, always felt like, okay, his stuff is already out there. But increasingly, I think we're at a moment where the debates about Web 2, Web 3 have become so kind of high stakes and are involving people who have not been hanging around all this time reading his blog posts. A lot of the people who are just beginning to encounter this stuff are reading the boosters, or they're encountering these kind of shillers, these people who are just, trying to sell their latest shitcoin, and I keep wanting to say, if you want to understand what is kind of wacky about this stuff, it's not like I endorse and agree with everything he says, but like, this is an example of a very interesting thinker who, is behind one of these major projects. So it just came to feel more and more urgent to make those writings more accessible, more available to people who haven't been along for the whole ride. And so we've put together the book in a way where it provides some context. I have some brief introductions and there are some notes and there's a glossary. And so the terms that he's throwing out, expecting an audience of people who are in the scene, there's a little bit of a bridge for those who are new to it. But it has been really, fun to work on. And Vitalik is donating all of his proceeds to the Gitcoin matching pool to support public goods. And so, it's a project that just kind of feeds, I think, a lot of the better parts of this community. I hope, to me, it all comes back to, when he first introduced Ethereum at the Bitcoin Miami conference, he talked about all the great things it can do. And then at the end, he said, or Skynet, right? The robot computer that starts exterminating the human race in the Terminator movies, and I take that very seriously. I think there is immense danger in these technologies. And what I appreciate about his essays too, and that we've collected in this book, is that they too appreciate that what matters less is like, do you like crypto or not? What matters more is, what do you do with it? How do you design it? What assumptions do you bring to it? And to me, that's the question that we need to be asking much more than the question of, crypto or no crypto.
Absolutely. I think with the technology and so much buzz and discussions going around it, it's very important that we provide, I think, more of a more educated content to the general public. Are you going to make this one of the required readings for your class, for students?
No, because if I do that, I have to fill out all kinds of disclosure forms. So I live my life around trying to avoid forms from the university. And I don't teach crypto classes. I usually have a session or so in my classes, but now actually there are at least 2 blockchain related classes at my university this semester. And we did a little event where we brought together everybody who was teaching them. And so there's real interest and activity around this stuff starting to form. And, it does pose the question always of like, as a scholar, as a teacher, what is our role? Is it just to lift up and celebrate and say this is the greatest thing ever? Is it to bombard people with hard questions about the ethical possibilities and dangers? How much should we emphasize this stuff? How much credit should we give to those who say that this is the future? Those are questions we have to struggle with. But whatever it turns out to be, right now there's enough really creative, fascinating work going on in this world that it feels worth some attention.
Absolutely. Got to keep maintaining that kind of critical mindset, looking at all these changes the technology brings us. Where do you see Ethereum in this decentralized social network space in the future?
Yeah, it's so bewildering what's going on right now. I mean, it does seem like Ethereum is moving from being the kind of main point of interface that people are using toward being a kind of interface among interfaces. There are good kind of technical reasons for that transition. And, what's interesting to me about this moment, though, is the kind of market for governance that's emerging. If there are going to be lots of different layer 2s, if there are lots of different protocols that people can choose from, how are the ways that they're governed and the choices that they make going to guide participation? So for instance, currently these networks are designed to be incredibly neutral, right? In some ways that's just kind of makes the design process easier and is allowed people to focus on solving kind of the basic scalability problems and things like that. Of course, we have to recognize, the kinds of human rights issues, for instance, that have arisen in the context of Web 2, genocide in Myanmar to election manipulation and so much more. You can imagine when digital money is involved, the danger becomes so much more great. How we begin to encode values and non-negotiables into these networks, I think is kind of the next frontier. I hope that this emerging diversity of spaces will create that opening where someone can say, like, no code is going to run on this protocol that is going to cause these kinds of human rights abuses. If we can provably demonstrate that a contract is being used in that way, it doesn't run anymore. These kinds of questions. Can we provably demonstrate that we're not emitting carbon, right? That nobody in this system is freeloading off of, destroying the climate. That kind of possibility, I think, is something that we have the chance to enter into now. A lot of the discussions I see here about just are optimizing for particular products and this sort of thing. But I think we have to take much more seriously the sense that if these networks are going to become a new layer of global connectivity, in some respects replacing or doing what existing global institutions have failed to do, let's make sure that we, are at least at their level in terms of having a sense of a human rights discourse, of having a sense that there are lines that we do not cross, that there are planetary barriers and boundaries and limits that we need to respect. And let's take seriously the responsibility that we really have in designing these tools. And, that's not just being a downer. Like, that's a really fascinating design space. Unfortunately, it requires a different kind of investment than private gain. Because private gain pays for itself for the people involved in a certain way. To create a sense of the common and the public, we need to make commitments that we're going to invest in these things together, even without a kind of short-term financial return. I do think in the end, there's a reason why, the biggest companies in the world are incorporated in highly regulated countries. Regulations are actually good for business. Like, not violating human rights is good for business. So I don't think that those things are orthogonal. And I think it's actually very dangerous not to prioritize them for future economic possibilities. So I don't know what the future is, but I think it really depends on our willingness to recognize the responsibility that lies in the designs that are being made now.
Absolutely. We're also hoping to see more of these active civic participation, new types of political discourse, and really having what Hana was talking about, the netizens maybe of this new web era participating in some of the policies that were historically, owned by institutions. And so it's I think, very exciting movement that we're witnessing from a social and political level outside of the technology space.
Yeah, it's a great point about the netizen piece. Lately, there's anxiety about citizenship because it can be used as a language to dehumanize others who are not citizens. But we do need a language that recognizes the humanity, the aliveness, because we don't just want to stop at humans, but to create a mode of seeing where these networks, are forced to recognize that, the dignity and the value of every person involved in them.
Absolutely.
Well, I have no comments to add. I think this is a perfect ending of today's podcast.
Yeah. I've had so much pleasure, listening to what Nathan has to say. Super, super enlightening.
For sure. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both so much.